Welcome to Story Time with Chris Horner. In this edition, I'd like to talk about the struggles of the professional athletes out there that are trying to make ends meet financially when you have so many different factors that you just are not under control. Now, we look at today's racing here in the professional Peloton with the cyclists, and you see the merger between Pseudo Quickstep and Jumbo-Visma. Hasn't quite officially happened yet, but we see all the stories and the drama, and this is what a lot of the professional athletes have to deal with year in and year out. Now, you guys that follow my channel know that I was a professional cyclist for 25 years, and during that time, I've counted up at least 7 seasons that financially there were struggles in there and a lot of doubts and big time efforts put into trying to get paid during certain years and just to make ends meet. Now, I started turning professional at 1995, and when I turned professional in 95, there was an organization called US Pro. It wasn't USA Cycling, it was called US Pro. There was 2 divisions. Now, if you wanted to be pro in 1995, you could pay $150, turn pro, get your pro license, and you can go do any US Pro event there was as an independent rider. So in 1995, when I couldn't find a pro contract with a UCI team or USA Cycling Pro team, I decided I'd go ahead and get my individual pro license and turn pro as an unattached rider and then do those races like Thrift Drug and Philadelphia with the big one-day races on my own unattached, basically in a blank jersey. Okay, that was my first struggle of being a pro. I showed up at Thrift Drug all by myself. The very first race I did was actually the week before when I was doing the First Union Grand Prix races in Atlanta. I had raced as an amateur the night before at Athens Twilight and such, and then went over to do First Union Grand Prix there in Atlanta, and that was my first time doing a pro race. And then I stayed pro and did Thrift Drug as an independent just by myself with no help, no feeders, no nothing. I literally racing up the cobblestone climb there as they're going up the Thrift Drug Classic and had 2 kids on the side of the road holding up Dixie cups, passing out water to me that I would fill up my bottle as I'm going up a 13% climb and hit along with the 2 kids and their dad. That's what was feeding me as I was going up on the race. Okay, if the race finished, I hitched a ride from the Shimano guys in their van and they drove me back to my hotel because I had ridden my bike from the hotel down to the start of my second big pro one-day race with a map of the city in my pocket and my wallet. Sounds pretty funny, but it's a true story. If it wasn't for the father and the 2 kids with the large Dixie cups, I would have never been able to finish that race. When it was all said and done, I think I was 13th on the day. And then, like I said, hitched a ride back home with the Shimano guys back up to the hotel that was far away. And I was completely empty of energy. So thank you to the Shimano guys for getting me back to my hotel room on my second pro race day of my career. Now, after that period in 1995, US Pro and USA Cycling merged so that if you were going to be a pro rider, you had to join a UCI registered pro team. Now we see that happening and we see the mergers going on with Pseudo Quickstep and Jumbo-Visma right now and all the big talks. But we know there's about 50, 60 riders on each team because each team has about 30 riders. So there's a lot of guys that are going to go without a contract if these 2 teams merge. Now, I've told you guys in some earlier stories that in 2011, while I was racing for Radio Shack, that team merged with Leopard and became Leopard Radio Shack for the following year. But when we're talking about 2011, it wasn't so much stress on me at that point in time in terms of finding a team to ride for or getting the bills paid. The stress was really about, as I was on the largest contract that I had ever received throughout my 25 years of pro racing, I was going to sign up for 2 years for a contract of $1.25 million both years. So we're talking about $2.5 million to race in 2012 and 2013 if the team merges together and they do accept me. So let me back up the story a little bit further though so I can tell you about some of the stresses and the finances that the pro athletes have that they'll experience. Well, like I said, 1995, you saw me there racing independently there at Thrift Drug Classic, and then in 96, the team went pro Nutrifit. But it wasn't a big-time pro team. I think I was paid something around $3,000, $4,000, and you divide that up about 8 months out of the season, and that was the most that I'd gotten paid salary-wise from the team in 1996, and everything else I lived off of in 96 was prize money. Now, luckily in those days, the prize money was divided directly, basically right after the race. You'd finish the race, you'd do big-time criteriums in the 90s here racing domestically in the U.S., and you'd split up that prize money and go home with it right there as you're flying back to your house in San Diego, California, where I lived. You'd take that prize money home. But like I said, $3,000-$4,000 salary doesn't go very far, but it at least was paying the monthly rent on my one-bedroom, tiny, tiny little house in the backyard of somebody else's house there in Lemon Grove, California. That was enough to keep me racing. Now, in 1997, I started racing for one of the bigger teams. I was signed on with FDJ in 1997, and I agreed to do 97 and 98. Broke my arm in 98 after having a fantastic ride at Midi-Libre and was scheduled to do the Tour de France until I broke my arm, so I missed that opportunity. Mark Matteo was the director, as he still is right now with FDJ, and he came to the hospital that day and he said, hey, you're signed for next year, don't even stress about it. Mark Matteo was a fantastic director sportif in terms of knowing the stresses that the riders were feeling at those moments when you're at the end of your contract. It's June basically in the middle of the season, so you only have a few months left, and I got a broken arm sitting in a French hotel next to Paris. So Mark Matteo came up there, came to my hospital bed and said, Chris, don't stress about next year. I'm going to give you a new contract. And he upped the contract by about $20,000. I think I was making about 70 grand, if I'm not mistaken, with FDJ for that 1999 season. Now, we saw all the drama, of course, that happened in 1998 with the Festina Fair, happened in the July Tour de France, and the stress that was going on as a rider when I'm sitting there at Nice, and I got a broken arm, and I'm watching all the stress happening from the Festina Fair, and you're wondering if the sport's actually going to keep going on. Like, that's literally what you're thinking when you're a 25, 26-year-old kid sitting in a French apartment there in south of France, and with a broken arm, you're wondering, wow, is this really going to keep continuing? It looks like the whole sport's blowing up. Well, the Festina Fair blew over eventually, finally, and it took many years for that episode to go through, and maybe sometime I'll do a story time throughout that. But let's stay here a bit on just the financial stories here. Now, as the years passed by in 1999, I decided I was going to go back and start racing for Mercury in the U.S. for 2000 and 2001. I'd signed a 2-year contract for both those 2 seasons. Then in 2001, the team had grown a little bit and had come up to basically one of the top 10 best, strongest teams in the world and was trying to get over to the Tour de France in 2001. Signed big European riders, of course, like Peter Van Petegem, and riders that were going to help get us into the Tour de France. Now, that didn't happen, and the team had some problems with some doping controls with one of the French riders on the team, and so that allowed Viatel to escape the contract, and the team folded mid-season in 2001. Now, this was June, July, if I remember correctly, and you're going over to the mailbox to pick up your paycheck, because you know it normally comes on about the 15th of each month, and you go there and there's no paycheck. There's no paycheck the next day, there's no paycheck the day after that, and about 3 days go by before you finally actually hear from the manager of the team that there's not going to be any paycheck. The team is kind of collapsing. Got a little bit crazy in 2001. There was about 8-10 of us, a lot of the European riders like Peter Van Petegem and Pavel Tonkov, the Giro d'Italia winner from a few years back, that was on the team. Myself, Floyd Landis, and a bunch of the other European riders refused to sign a contract that said that we were all paid up in full. Now, without John Warden, the director sportif for Mercury, being able to have every rider sign a contract like that, that meant that the team would have to fold. Well, the UCI found some loopholes around that, and they basically suspended the riders that wouldn't sign that contract so the Mercury team could continue to exist through the finish of that season. But the UCI also didn't allow us to leave our contracts. Now, we look at the merger right now with Soudal Quick-Step and with Jumbo-Visma. Those riders, whichever contract they take, whether it's the Team Netherlands from Jumbo-Visma or the Belgium contract from Soudal Quick-Step, the other contract that's not taken, if the team doesn't exist, will terminate. Those riders will be free to leave. But in 2001, with Mercury Viatel, that was just now Mercury because Viatel had left, we weren't free to leave. So I was kind of locked still under the contract and fighting with the UCI to get a release along with the other European riders, because if we can't get released from our contract, you can't find another team to work for. And if you can't find another team to work for, you can't find a job to finish the season. So 2001 was a bit of a stressful season. I just ended up buying a new home just earlier, the season before that, at the end of the year. So financially, it was a stressful time in my life. And luckily there was this new invention called eBay out there, so it allowed me to hand off a bunch of my bikes and sell through eBay and clothing to make up some financial stuff to try to keep from avoiding claiming bankruptcy. That's basically what it come down to in my career at that moment in 2001. Financially, you wasn't in a position where you could survive 6 months till you find that next team that starts in January, because remember, team contracts go all the way from January 1st to December 31st when the team stops paying you in June and the UCI doesn't accept that you guys aren't getting paid and they find some loophole to allow the team to continue. That means we still can't find jobs to get paid. So went through that 6 months of stressful time, and basically I made it through that by going through eBay and cherry picking all the criterium races around the US that I could possibly get to cheaply, teaming up with riders, winning criterium races, putting the money in the pocket and paying the bills when you get back home and living month to month. That was the kind of stress you're dealing with. And when you see this merger happening with Pseudo Quickstep and of course with Jumbo-Visma, some of the younger kids, I'm sure, will be going through some of the experiences that I was going through in 2001. Now, we'll continue on because it was, like I said, I had about 6, 7 stories like that throughout my 25 years of career. And then as I switched teams and end up getting finally released from the UCI in time to just do a couple of the last season races here domestically for Prime Alliance, found some more way to make some more prize money by racing about 4 weeks, 5 weeks worth of racing domestically with Prime Alliance, and then they signed me for the following year. Now that following year with Prime Alliance, in 2002, everything went smooth. Then I signed in 2003 for Saturn. Saturn was a fantastically well-organized team. There was one hitch though when I signed in 2003. I wanted a 2-year contract and they had only a 1-year contract left with GM, which owns Saturn vehicles. So on my contract, I said I'd agree to come to the team in 2003, but I wanted GM to absolutely guarantee the second year whether if the team existed or not. So I was paid about $110,000, if I remember correctly, in 2003, and I raced with the Saturn team that season. Problem happened though is that Saturn, GM, that owned the company, they decided not to sponsor the team for the 2004 season, so therefore my contract was terminated all over again. So I was again in limbo. Now the upside was from 2003 and 2004, like I said, I had my contract guaranteed right through GM, the motor company themselves, and not through the bike company that had signed the riders. So my contract was actually paid in full for 2004, but I was left in limbo because you don't have time to look for other teams domestically when you're talking about September, October time, when you're finally released for your following season. And no one has the kind of budget to sign a top rider domestically. Now, domestically, you're never going to make a ton of money racing here in the U.S. Top riders, probably $100,000 to $150,000 tops, so you're not going to retire off that kind of money. And even though I did receive my second-year contract from GM, who paid out that contract of about $110,000, that gets you the money, but that doesn't get you to the races, right? So you still have to find a team to get to the races, and you still have to deal with that dilemma. Well, it ended up coming out that Webcor, a company there, a construction company in San Francisco, I signed for them for the 2004 season, and it went fantastic. It was a small contract, but I'd already been paid the year before from GM, like I told you. So financially, I was okay still. That was no problem. But then after the 2004 season, I signed, of course, with Sonia Duvall, and that season went pretty smooth. Had some little bank transfer issues where payments were coming a little bit late, but that was nobody's fault, other than some paperwork that was happening coming from Spain, getting it over to the U.S., so nobody to blame there. Rode, of course, in 2007 and 2006 with Lotto Soudal and Lotto Predictor. Now, those 2 years, I was paid about $175,000 euros, I believe, so about $200,000 US. But when you're splitting time between houses in Europe and in the US and you're traveling back and forth, about 20% of it's going to taxes, another 10% is going to your agent. That other money's getting wasted on the houses. You have a car in Europe, you have a car in other places. It doesn't end up being a whole ton of money out there. So you're not really living high off the hog there when you're talking about 200,000 US and half is going to taxes and your agent and a bunch of other stuff's going between houses that you're traveling. So it's tight times still when you're talking about racing in 06 and 07. There we had some problems financially when it came to paying out the bonuses at the end of the season. They weren't quite up to what we had agreed upon, and I ended up leaving Lotto team there, and I ended up signing with Astana with Johan Bernil. Now, there's a little bit of a chaos before that, because before I could finally get out of the lotto contract, I was looking at going over to rock racing in the U.S. Now, the owner there was Michael Ball. He was trying to put together a crazy team, and he had a great idea behind it all of a way to boost up cycling and all that stuff. But the problem was his contract, 17 pages worth, always had a clause somewhere within the 17 pages that they can terminate the contract at any point in time. I said I wouldn't sign it. They had to take that out. So I'm going through months of contract negotiations with the rock racing team, and then finally Johan Bernal calls me up from Team Astana. The Belgian, he says, Chris, we got a spot that's opening up for you. It looks like Pavel Savadelli might be leaving the team and retiring. If he does, we'd love to have you come on the team and you'd be our last rider for the team. Now, at the time, contract was probably about $200,000 if I remember correctly. But Johan Bernal did say he'd give an extra $25,000 if some other sponsors came in to the deal. Well, I ended up telling Johan Bernal, get me the contract, standard UCI contract. It'll be signed and sent back to you immediately. Johan Bernal sends me the contract. It's for $200,000. I sign it, send it back to him. About a month goes by, Johan Bernal calls me up and he says, Chris, that other sponsor came by. I'm going to bump your contract up $25,000. I have never in my career had a director sportif, a manager of a team, or anybody running a team that ever offered to pay more money but had an option not to pay you, still pay you. I was in awe when Johan Bernal called me up and said, we've just bumped your contract up. We'll rewrite it and send it over to you. You got an extra $25,000 on your contract. First experience I'd ever had in my life, and I was over 30 years old when Johan Bernal signed me to his Astana team. Well, it wasn't all peaches and cream there. Did love riding for Johan Bernal, but we ran into some problems, of course, with Astana. 2009, you might have remembered when Giro d'Italia, we were racing those blank jerseys that had none of the Kazakhstanian sponsors readable from the camera helicopter angles from the top, because we'd gone 3 months without getting paid that year in 2009 while I was doing the Giro d'Italia. Can you imagine? You're racing with Lance Armstrong on the team and we're at the Giro d'Italia and we're wearing blank jerseys there because we haven't been paid for 3 months. So again, you're going through all the stresses and the financial nightmares of what you're trying to accomplish as being a professional cyclist, where you're trying to focus 100% on being in the top, best form you can be on. But then every time you get off the bike and you get back home, you're wondering how you're going to pay the bills, right? 3 months is a long time to go. And during those 3 months, I had a bunch of different little investments set aside. So you pull some of the money out of those investments and then you finally get paid and you forget to put that money back into that investments, because it's kind of nice having a little bit of extra cash in your hand, and you realize that the Tesla stocks just skyrocketed and you lost about 100 grand there. So those are always the little dilemmas you're dealing with as a professional cyclist when you're not one of those riders that are making millions of dollars, or you're not an NFL player, or of course an NBA player, where you can survive these kind of these nightmare falls that are happening throughout your decade of racing. And you see right now, again, when we go back into Soudal Quick-Step and you go into Jumbo-Visma, this merger, you see where some of these young kids that are just coming into this team, we take a rider like Matteo Jorgensen, the American rider that just signed for Jumbo-Visma. What's going to happen with a rider like that, right? He's probably going through the exact same scenario that I was, where he was making about a couple $100 grand, maybe he's making 2 or 3 or something. But we've read the stories already from a rider, Matteo Jorgensen, where he spent a lot of his own money to really help him get better. He's paid for, of course, the coaches and a lot of the nutritional stuff that he thought he needed to take that next step in professional cycling. And I've seen it where he's had articles out there where he's talked about spending just about everything he's had. And now he's stuck right here in this merger, where if they don't accept him and they just terminate his contract, could be a rider like Matteo Jorgensen's in a bad place. And then, of course, the younger riders, when we're talking about Luc Lamperti, we're talking about the U.S. Pro Criterium champion rider that's just joining with Soudal Quick-Step. Same thing. He can't financially be in a spot where he could be in a golden place, where like Primoz Roglic, where he can jump ship and still find that $3, $4, $5 million contract that he's going to get from Bora Hansgrohe. Well, I got a few more stories still, so we'll go back into my career here. And as we're finishing up 2009, Johan Bernal did find the money, did get us paid, did get us caught up there for Astana. And then later we end up merging and becoming Radio Shack. As we became Radio Shack in 2011, I ended up having a very good spring season where I was 4th at Volta a Catalonia, ended up going 2nd at the Basque Country, ended up winning Tour of California, and then I was going into the Tour de France in 2011, and I was riding very good. 13th, top 15th on the general classification going into stage 7, and it was the last flat stage of that year's 2011 Tour de France in the first week. There'll be more flat stages, of course, but after stage 7, that's when we started climbing. So I knew I was in a good spot on the GC position. When I looked at my spot at 13th, there was really only 4 or 5 GC guys in front of me, so I'm looking at about 5th or 6th on general classification at that point in time as we're finishing the flat first week of racing at that year's 2011 Tour de France. Well, story comes as we come into the last 20 miles to go. There's a big crash. I'm knocked out. Riding on autopilot all the way to the finish of the stage. Don't remember any of the stage whatsoever. Don't remember getting on my bike. Don't remember holding onto the car to get back to the gruppetto. Don't remember riding 20 miles or 30 kilometers in the gruppetto. And I'd hear stories from my old teammates in there, Gert Stegels, talking about how while I was in that gruppettos, we're trying to finish that stage 7 of the Tour de France, I'd go back to Gert Stegels and say, "Where are we at?" He'd say, "You're at the Tour de France." And I say, "Are we in the break?" He'd go, "No, you're not in the break. We're in the gruppetto. Everything's okay. Just keep riding." I'd rotate through, go to the front, rotate to the back, put my hand up, call the car up. I'd go back to the car and I'd ask the car, "Where are we at?" And they say, "You're in the Tour de France. Just stay in the front group, stay by Stegels, he'll take care of you." Maybe some of you guys saw in that 2011 stage 7 of the Tour de France when I crossed the finish line and I still didn't know where I was at, even though I just got done finishing crossing the line at the Tour de France. Well, I ended up spending the night in the hospital that night, and then the next morning at 8:15 a.m. is when the light bulb came on, and that's when I started coming back to reality of what had happened to me. End up taking a flight back to the U.S., and as I'm sitting back at the U.S., I end up getting a blood clot in my lung, and so I'm on blood thinner, so I can't race my bike the rest of the season. Now, why did I tell you that story? Well, the final part of the season after that 2011 Tour de France, the team was merging. It was going to become Leopard Radio Shack. So with that happening, the merger was happening just as we're seeing now with Pseudo Quick-Step and Jumbo-Visma, and we had too many riders. So I just got done signing a letter of intent after the Tour of California when I won in 2011 that I was going to sign that $1.25 million contract for 2 years, so $2.5 million. It was going to be finally the contract that I've been looking forward to throughout my whole career that financially would set you up for after your career of racing. Before that, everything, the 2 years before that, not so bad. It was good money. I was making about $400,000. But before that, it was struggle, month-to-month payments all the time, just trying to keep up. And you were lucky if you had 10 or 20 grand in the bank at any one point in time, the 10, 15 years before that period. So this contract was super important. I'm sitting here at my Bend, Oregon house, and I'm hearing about the merger come together. And you're starting to hear about the stress. Some of the younger kids are calling me, asking me if I know the details of what's happening. And then, of course, it all comes out that we're merging, of course, there with Leopard, and we're merging with Radio Shack. So who are the team going to keep? Well, immediately, I'm talking with Johan Brunel, and he's telling me that, hey, everything's good. You're part of the team that's coming over. You're going to be there. But I know the Leopard owner over there doesn't really know who Chris Horner is, even though I won the Tour of California. It's not the Tour de France. Even though I won the Basque Country earlier in 2010, it's not the Tour de France. So I understand professionally at that point in time when I'm over 35 years of age that it could be some drama if they decide they don't want to sign the guy for $1.25 million on a 2-year deal that maybe the owner of Leopard's not familiar with. So I'm taking some other calls from other teams that are trying to sign me because, of course, I've got results on my resume at this point in time in my career. And I've got a contract coming from Astana that they're asking, and I'm talking with Specialized, Mike Sinyard, and he's calling me up saying, hey, we'd love to have you on the team. Are you interested in coming over? And I said, I'm interested in coming over, but I really like where I am, and I love racing for Johan Brunel. So let me see how it's going and what it's talking about. And financially, the Astana deal wasn't as good as the Radio Shack deal, but Astana was there, and the contract was going to be offered. The Radio Shack, I had a letter of intent, and I was being told from the word from Johan Brunel. Now, this was why I told you the story of the $25,000 that Johan Brunel offered me a few years earlier and gave to me without any argument whatsoever. When the team was merging together, Johan Brunel said, Chris, you have my word. You're signed. You're one of the first 3 riders that were merging with these guys. I remembered that $25,000 from when we first signed way back there in 2008 when I was signing with Astana. I remembered him throwing that $25,000, and I thought, man, his word has been golden, and he has been a fantastic director and manager here throughout the years I've worked with him. I'm going to take his word for it, and we're going to put everything on the line. We merged, and I end up becoming part of that Leopard Radio Shack team, and of course, later won the Vuelta a España in 2013 with that team, so everything worked out well. But there's always these stresses of financial situations throughout everyone's career. And throughout my 25 years of racing, like I said, I can remember at least 7 that were very stressful, and none bigger than that 2011 and 2012 merger between those two teams that I'm sure all of us right now are glued to our seats on watching to see how Pseudo Quickstep and Jumbo-Visma will come out of this. But remember, behind all the riders that don't merge with the team that comes together as the most dominant team, there's always going to be a story of stress behind. And this is what all the pro athletes have to worry about when you're talking about these sports where it's not quite the NBA or NBA or professional soccer over in Europe. Those guys don't have to stress so much when you're paid $5 million. But the guys who are making $70,000, $100,000, $150,000, those guys have to stress a lot, and that's what we know is happening right now between the riders from Jumbo-Visma and from Pseudo Quickstep right now, and of course the staff. Don't forget the soigneurs and the mechanics, because all those guys aren't going to be kept either. So throughout these professional sports, when you're talking about the second pay sports, and that's professional cycling, there's a ton of stress happening, and lots of that stress causes a lot of problems for these riders to arrive on their best form and to perform the best they can when they're wondering how they're going to pay their rent for the next month. All right, guys, that's my story up here for Storytime with Chris Horner. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you can appreciate when you start seeing some of the dilemma that's happening over here, because when you're looking at professional sports, there's always politics, and there's always a ton of drama, and getting paid is always a big part of it when you're racing bicycles professionally over in the European Peloton, or of course here at the domestic scene in the US. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'll see you for the next story time sometime in the near future. Like and subscribe. I'll see you then.